Hello everybody, my name is Brian Mann, and I'd like to take you on a little trip here. I'm in western Iowa, and I'm beginning to film various locations in what is called the Loess Hills. It's spelled L-O-E-S-S, but it's pronounced Loess. And these hills run from the Missouri border all the way up to the South Dakota and Minnesota border along the western tier of counties in western Iowa. And I'm also going to be mixing in some family history because the spot I'm at right now is called Preparation Canyon, and I'm actually in the original settlement area that was established in 1853, and my great-great-grandfather Charles Perrin was part of the original settlers that settled here. And I'm going to take you on a little stroll and explain what I know. I'm learning more and more about this place as the years roll by, but I'm going to explain to you what I do know and show you some sites up in this old settlement area. So I'm just going to pan the camera here and give you an idea of what this place looks like. So just to the right of this tree here on the left side of the screen, that big open field right in here. And even back behind me, I believe back in the timber here before these trees were here, because this is 167 years ago that they first settled here. But right out in here and throughout most of this area, there were 67 buildings. And you probably can't see it. I'll walk out there further, but just below the crest of the horizon there, about halfway up between the shadow and the horizon line, there's a flat spot. And that was the original two-story building that was built. And the leader of this settlement area was a man by the name of Charles B. Thompson. He was a Mormon. I think he was ordained as an elder in the Latter-day Saint Church, probably in the 1830s, early 1830s, back in Ohio. And he moved out this way, and long story short, my family got involved and got connected with him, and they came up this way to settle. So a little bit of the history of the land that I'm walking on actually belonged to my relatives, belonged to the Perrins. And Charles Chauncey Perrin, my great-great-grandfather, who was one of the original settlers that settled here, his first son, Thomas, my dad and I call him Old Tom, he had a son, and his name was Walter. And Walter had a sister named Evelyn. And so they would be like my second cousins, I think, or third cousins. And Evelyn never married. Walter married a lady by the name of Martha. And the short story here is that long after Walter had died, I can't remember what year he died, but around 1934, the parents donated about 82 acres of land to what is now, if you're familiar with the park area, but way up past the hill here, up on top of the hill is the Preparation Canyon State Park. And in 1934, they donated that land, 82 acres, to start basically what is now a larger park area. And then in 1969, I believe it's most of this land that's in front of me right now, they donated 157 more acres to the park. And I think it's most of this original settlement area, the timber back in here, and you can't see it, but the entrance here on the other side of the road is the actual original house that my two distant cousins lived in, Martha and Evelyn Perrin. And it was later that they donated what was the rest of the land, because I know they had there's a set of buildings here that my dad remembers right up here by this tree line when he was a young boy. But all in all, when they donated the land into 3 different chunks, it's a total of 344 acres that makes up this Preparation Canyon State Park. And we're going to take a walk up that ridge and talk a little bit about the history that's here, and can show you some different vantage points to where all these buildings used to be, and maybe find some old wagon rut roads. I know where I believe is 11 to 12 people that are buried, some of the early settlers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that once I get you there. So I'm just a little further up this walking path. There's the familiar hill that we were looking at just a minute ago. You can hear this babbling brook. Must be some rocks down there causing a little bit of motion. See if I can't step down here a little closer. This is Spring Grove Creek. So you have to wonder, back 167 years ago when people were settling this country, what made them settle in the places that they settled? Well, in this particular case, my great-great-grandfather returned home from his Mormon battalion march when he left what is now around the Iowa School for the Deaf area and marched all the way to San Diego, back up through California. He got in on a little bit of the gold rush that was happening and made his way back to Canesville, which is today known as Council Bluffs, around spring of 49 or maybe 48. I can't remember 100%. I do the math on my great-grandfather. I could tell you whether it was 48 or 49. But nonetheless, he was there with his family. He had 2 sons, and my great-grandfather would have been the 3rd son born there in Council Bluffs. I know my grandfather was born in 49, so it had been early spring 48 when he got back. But anyway, he got connected with Charles B. Thompson. And I don't believe my great-grandfather was part of the guys that did this, but I know that he might have been. But Charles B. Thompson enlisted the services of a man by the name of Guy C. Barnum. And him and a couple other guys started making their way up the Iowa side of the Missouri River north, trying to find places to settle. And the story is they went to the Honey Creek Valley, which was the first river north from Canesville. And there was a lot of wood, a lot of timber there, but no running water year round. So they proceeded north to what is the Boyer River Valley, comes down from Dunlap and Woodbine and Logan, Missouri Valley. And they came to the same conclusion, not enough persistent water. And then they made their way up to the Soldier River Valley, which angles up into the rough Loess Hills, just south of the old town of Orson, and makes its way up through Pisgah and Moorhead and Soldier. And they came to this spot, and they found this, the Spring Grove Creek. And it had water in it all year round. And you can see, I've never actually seen it with this much water in all my life. But this is why they settled here, because of the abundance of water and the lay of this land. And I think that's why. So I've made my way up the trail here a bit. And I also will mention that this land is cared for by the Department of Natural Resources in Iowa. And they do a great job taking care of this place. They keep this walkway, this path goes all the way up through. And they do a wonderful job taking care of it. And there's actually some dry camp spots up in here. There's no facilities, but there are camp spots. And here's where I just want to kind of make note. Not 100% sure whether it's this kind of a flat spot right here or down this little ditch, if it's this next little flat spot here. But one of these two places is where Charles B. Thompson's 2-story house or building was erected. And again, 67 buildings that were built and constructed in this area, all through this open field, possibly across the field there, across the road into that cornfield a bit, and definitely down in here before these trees ever existed. And the interesting thing was, when they got here, there wasn't a lot of timber like you see here. It was pretty desolate because it was 1853, and man was not involved with controlling fires and things like that, and that's what kept the trees burnt down. So they ended up getting the lumber for most of these buildings down at Honey Creek, and that's probably 25 miles. They cut that wood and brought it up here and milled it and built these homes, built these buildings. There was a post office, there's a stockade, a variety of, I mean, it was actually a town for at least about 5 years, 1853 to 1858, until some of the members of this commune, that's what I would call it, started to wise up, my great-great-grandfather being one of them. And one day we're going to lynch old Charles B. Thompson and Guy C. Barnum. And I'll get to that story in a minute. Well, here you can kind of see a little better, I think, kind of these flat spots. Realize they didn't have bulldozers back in them days. The only thing they had was you know, big blades they could pull behind teams to move dirt. So you'd have to use your common sense, just like today. And if I was going to build a building here, I would find the flattest spot possible to minimize the amount of work I'd have to put in the foundation to create a level base for my building. And so that's why I believe it's right around here. And if I can include in the video, there is an artist rendition of this settlement area that I believe was in a Monona County history book, 1892 or something like that. And it kind of shows it right around one of these two flat spots right here. Who knows? Just another vantage point as I'm crawling higher up this hill of the old original settlement area. I have good reason to believe, based on some stories that were passed down, based on some very primitive discovery means, that right here in this flat spot, and possibly even underneath this path here, there are approximately 11 or 12 people that are buried here. You would never know it. But I do know that from looking at or reading the history books that several people did perish living here, and they had to be buried somewhere. And the information that I have received from other distant relatives is that it's right about here. And the story is, you can see this little tree right in front of me here, a little shrubby tree. And I'll try to move the camera down here, but if you go look right down the hill, and you see that big old tree, there used to be a fence line that ran right up here. And that's how they knew from, I think it was my third cousin told me this, passed down from his grandfather, great-grandfather, that's how they knew where it was, standing down by that tree, looking up the hill, you know, almost straight east. And it was just to the south on this flat spot right here. And it kind of makes sense. Cemetery, top of the hill that sits above all the buildings. People can look up here and see where their loved ones have been buried. So someday it would be nice to confirm it. Maybe raise some money through donations and put up the old-fashioned wrought iron fence that you see in some of the old cemeteries. And maybe just put up a plaque that acknowledges that they're here. I just think it adds to the mystique adds to the story of this beautiful place. They're up high enough here now you can see across the Soldier River Valley here, kind of in this saddle. The near tree line, way in the back you see the horizon. And that's just the bluffs that are on the east side of the Soldier River. Runs up through here. You can see this this trail rises pretty high up the side of this, up the crest of this ridge. So I caught my breath a little bit. It's quite the hike up that steep little slope. So let me explain a little bit of the history of how this place fell apart. So Charles B. Thompson claimed that he was ordained from visions that he was to be called Father Ephraim, after the biblical man Ephraim. And he convinced his followers, my great-great-grandfather, Charles Chauncey Perrin, and my great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother, and others, to essentially deed over all of their personal property to him for the betterment of the community, for the commune. And he set up a couple of different schools and asked that they all pay 10% of their income and property as tuition to these schools, because this was supposed to be the place of preparation for moving on after this life and moving on into eternity. That's how it got its name, preparation. And to make the long story short, eventually members of the community started to wise up to what Charles B. Thompson was really up to, because he had managed to convince people to deed over their land to him as well. And by the late 1850s, he had nearly 3,200 acres of land that was deeded over to his name. And he had sent some of the elderly men away on missions. And I believe that, I don't know if the timing is exactly right, but Charles B. Thompson went back to St. Louis, which is where he was from prior to moving here. And evidently, people started to think about what was going on and started to wise up, and they came back home. And while Charles B. Thompson was in St. Louis, they gathered together and reclaimed as much of their personal property as that they could find. And I don't know when it was. I think it was 1858. Things had continued on, and there was obviously friction. People were starting to split out away from this community. But Charles B. Thompson and Guy C. Barnum, which I think was his right-hand man, were on their way back from Ottawa, coming this way. And I know from history books, and I also know from a deposition that I have read from court case in 1868, which at that time the district court was in St. Louis, and a lot of the members here were suing Charles B. Thompson for basically their property. And before I get into that, I came across that deposition because somehow, probably about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe even 15, I somehow came in contact with Charles B. Thompson's great-grandson. I can't remember the gentleman's name. If I recall, I'll maybe put a bar underneath the video here. But when I talked to him, he was in his 80s. And we had several great conversations over the phone. And he's the one that sent me this 200-some page deposition. And in there, it talked about Charles Chauncey Perrin and 2 or 3 other people or more had enough. And they were going to lynch Charles B. Thompson. And if it hadn't been for a young lady of a family, a daughter of a family that was living with Charles B. Thompson, who about 3/4 of a mile in this direction waited for Charles B. Thompson and Guy C. Barnum to return from Ottawa and warned them that there was a lynch mob heading their way, he probably would have gotten lynched. And upon hearing that, he and Guy C. Barnum unhitched his team of horses from their wagons, jumped on those horses and turned around and rode hell-bent for election back to Ottawa, and hid out in the attic of the dentist at that time in Ottawa, and they moved up to Sioux City and hid out in the attics of people there until they finally were smuggled out of the area, and then commenced the falling apart of the settlement area. And my family then, Charles Chauncey Perrin and his family ended up settling, and long story short there, that's how they acquired all of this land and eventually donated it to the Preparation Canyon State Park here in western Iowa. I often wonder and imagined what this place looked like 160 years ago. And I imagine the vegetation, the sumac that I'm walking through here, and the native prairie grass left and right of this trail. Actually, when I'm walking on, they just mowed it. But whether all these oak trees were here, I don't know. I don't believe so. I mean, those trees are not 160 years old. But I often wonder what the landscape looked like and what trees were here at that time. It certainly would be interesting to have a time-lapse photography of the area, see how it's changed over the time. But it don't get any better than this. It's so beautiful today. Maybe a 2-mile-an-hour breeze, probably about 68 degrees. So we're approaching the north end of the greater settlement area here. Most of the buildings, again, were to the south here, down the other side of that hill we just came up. But recorded history is correct. There were a lot of people that couldn't afford framed buildings, framed house. As I understand it, and I have an 1856 census of this place, and on that census was around 265 to 270 people that were living here in 1856. And a lot of the people that couldn't afford frame homes, because it costs, I'm sure, today's amount of money it would be pennies, but back then pennies was a lot of money. They made dwellings by digging dugout caves in this less dirt. And I'm not sure how far they spanned here, if they're on the opposite side there in the timber line, that hill sloping up there. I do know that back where we started, back just to the south and east of Spring Grove Creek, you can't see it through the hill, but through the trees, but there's a good hill that comes down there. And I recall when I was a teenager finding piles, odd-looking mounds of dirt that were just kind of out on the flat, just a few feet away from where the hill kind of terminated to the flat bottom. And you got to wonder if that's the dirt that they dug out of the caves. But I haven't explored much, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were other dugouts up in this area here. Pretty well protected. And people back then had to do what they had to do. And they were following the beliefs that moved them and motivated them so strongly. Does it surprise me what humans will do when motivated, whether those motivations are good or bad. This is by far my favorite part of the trail. Now we're kind of coming down, angling down the west side of this ridge that runs north and south, kind of meandering through the thicket. My favorite little tree tunnel here. It's been there for a long time. Man, I would love to wake up every day to this. I need to brush up on my tree identification. I'm not real sure. I mean, I know what a cottonwood looks like. I know what a Chinese elm is. I know what an oak tree looks like. But some of these, I'm not sure. Dogwood, hickory, red oak. You'll find all those trees in this part of the country. Some's good for fires and some's good for building. Some for neither. Step. A little bit of dew on the grass this morning, and if I don't pay attention, I could put this old man right on his keister. Hope I don't disturb some campers down in here still sleeping. This little spot here, I'll turn my camera, pan to the left here in just a minute, has always intrigued me as a spot where if I was dirt broke, dirt poor, and all I had was a shovel, I needed to make me a home, I would have done it right back up in here. Maybe I should have turned the camera down there, back further. Let me see right here, maybe you can see. Yeah, right up here. What a perfect place. And I have not walked up in there in years. It wouldn't surprise me if you could find evidence of dugout caves where people lived. Now, I'm not going to go down this path because I'm certain if I do, I'm going to disrupt some campers. But if you take this path here, that one, it will take you up further north to a point where you cross the Spring Grove Creek, and you kind of wanders back up the ridge of the timberline that you hopefully recall seeing in some of the previous shots. And you kind of wander back around in there before you really start climbing up the hill. And at some point, you come to the spot where the Spring Grove Creek originates right out of the ground, bubbling up out of the ground. That's how this place has water in it all year round. Some runoff, but most of it's coming from the seepage under the surface. So here's my favorite tree of this entire place, and this video probably doesn't do it justice. I'll kind of pan around at the top here. You can see how it sprawls out. I don't know what kind of tree it is, so I'm not going to guess. But I do know it's been here for a long time, because I can remember this tree when I was a youngin', walking down in here before any of these paths were here. And you can see how big around that trunk is and how huge those branches are, those limbs. It makes me wonder if this tree was a brand new little seedling, sprouting its first leaf and soaking in the sun at the time that my great-great-grandfather was here. I don't know. I mean, one way to tell, cut it down, count the rings, but I would fight hard to prevent that from happening. But it sure is beautiful. Now what we're coming on here is an old road. I'm certain it was used in the early 1900s by the farmers, but I also believe that this is from stories, I've read from interviews by Evelyn and Martha Perrin, that they located wagon ruts in 1965 and talked about it. But this certainly is interesting and unique. And you can see how thick the foliage is. And this old ditch here that flows down to Spring Grove Creek, they've cleaned it up. I remember there used to be an old car in here. Because, you know, back in the days when this was just some person's farm, it was their farm. They did what they wanted to do, and nobody was the wiser. But this is one of the old roads in the original settlement area. We're headed just about straight south right now. So here's this big old tree I pointed out earlier. That is kind of the start of this fence road that runs up the hill here to my left to the east, and is one of the landmarks, I guess, for how to find those potential graves. And you really can't see it because the sun's too bright, but you can see the trees that kind of run right up the hill there. That's how some trees get planted, as birds eat seeds. Birds set on fence posts or wire and rest. Birds do their business, drop the seeds. Tree grows with instant fertilizer. But you probably can't see it. I can't point, but those graves are right about in there. So now we're walking down the west side of that ridge that we walked up. We're heading south. And my dad recalls stories passed on to him that there were people living up in this part as well, not just over the hill on that big open grassy area that that you see when you first enter the settlement area. And it doesn't surprise me. 267 people. I would have to probably sprawl out a bit. Well, I'm going to call that a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the hike and a little history lesson about my family history and the ties and connections to this place. So just took you through the lower part of the Preparation Canyon State Park, the actual old settlement area. And if you enjoyed this, I would ask you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It is 4WD Expedition. Stands for forward or four-wheel drive expedition. And my goal is to post videos about the Loess Hills in western Iowa, the Sand Hills in central Nebraska, and when I can find time to get way far away, my adventures with my 2011 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon with my rooftop tent and driving through BLM land and exploring places that I've never been to before. So again, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you later.